Welcome to the City. I'm Anthony Wilson, the Public Information Officer for the City of San Angelo. And joining us today are our two Chief Financial Officers for the City of San Angelo. We have our Finance Director, Tina Carragher, and our Budget Manager, Morgan Chegwidden. Ladies, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having us. Absolutely.
So we want to talk about city finances, but before we talk about the fiscal year 2017 budget, that'll be the coming year's budget, let's talk about the current year's budget. We know that sales tax collections are down from what they were a year ago. How are they compared to what was budgeted for this year?
You know, we budgeted pretty conservatively going into fiscal year 16. So this time last year, we were looking at receipts. We knew that they were growing quite healthily. And so we just proposed a 1.5% increase to actuals to budget at $19.2 million. But unfortunately, we're not really achieving that. And so we've taken measures to try to manage that. But we are projecting we're going to be anywhere from $2.1 to $2.4 million short in revenue.
And so, Tina, tell us why sales tax collections are important as far as the city budget goes.
Sure. Well, they help support the general fund. Of course, our biggest support to the general fund would be the property tax revenue. It's almost half of our, it's about 26% of general fund revenue. And sales tax is just a little bit less than that. But so we really depend on it to support general fund functions like, you know, public safety, parks, operations, things like that. And so it's a huge supporter of how we operate the city.
You know, it's a little puzzling to me why we're falling behind in sales tax collections, because outwardly, San Angelo's economy doesn't seem to be suffering. I mean, employment remains high. There's still lots of construction. We see new businesses entering the market. What do you guys think is at the root of the slower sales tax collections?
You know, I do think that that's important to note that the underlying economy in San Angelo is really strong. We had some crazy high growth in 14 and 15, and I think we knew that. We knew that we had a lot of traffic going on in town, a lot of industry, a lot of stuff going on that we hadn't had in recent years. So we knew going into 16, the year we're in right now, that things were going to slow down a little bit and be a little more normal. You know, we had some abnormally high growth in our economy. But as we drill down into it, it's difficult to tell. You know, we see that total retailers is up, and so hopefully that indicates that we're at the end of this decline. We see that total number of taxpayers registering, which includes our online folks, that's up even more. So there's lots of traffic going on. We're hoping that we're at the end of this blip, so to speak, in our growth. And for example, we saw in the lumber yard industry and home improvement, things like that, building supplies, that's down abnormally low. And so I think that was something that we just had some key industries like that were down a lot. And so we're just feeling that a little harder than other communities.
And I guess it could be worse because some communities, when you think of Midland and Odessa, that are so reliant on the oil patch, are seeing a lot worse sales tax collections than what we're seeing here.
That's right. And percentage-wise, they're down much more proportionately to what they budgeted. So.
And they build their policies around kind of a feast or famine type thing. We're lucky in San Angelo that we have slow and steady growth, and that certainly helps us all sleep at night, that we know that the revenue we have today is going to be there tomorrow, and that we're not growing faster than usual. And so since we did have that abnormal growth, it's not unusual that we would have that abnormal kind of shrinkage to come back from that.
So if there is a sales tax deficit, how is that difference covered in the budget?
Sure. We're projecting this year, again, the $2.1 to $2.4 million deficit. Our city manager was very committed to actual revenues exceeding or equaling actual expenses, that we really just left no stone unturned to make sure that we could satisfy that deficit. We didn't want to go back to the council and be able to say, you know, whoops, this happened. You know, we wanted to be proactive in addressing that. And so one thing we had done was we had funded street maintenance inflation. But since that inflation didn't occur, we were able to cut that budget by $500,000, but maintain current service levels. So really no impact to citizens there. We also had some just kind of naturally occurring personnel savings and payroll, just due to turnover in departments that have a lot of vacancies. That was about $558,000 as well. And so we researched items like that to make sure that we could satisfy that deficit, and we've been diligently reporting to the city manager on our progress.
And have we had to cut any services as a result of that?
No, thankfully, this far we've not had to cut any services. We've been able, through the budget office's research, been able to find areas where we would either cut back expenditures or find expenditures that didn't necessarily need to be made this year. And so they've been diligently submitting budget amendments to the city manager, and he's been approving those. And so we feel like we've got a really good handle on it moving forward.
Now, you mentioned that the general fund is supported by our sales and property taxes. So what's the state of the fund balance in our general fund at the moment?
It's actually a lot better than we've ever seen it before due to the sales tax growth in the last 3 or 4 years. We've been able to actually contribute to our general fund balance the last several years. So right now I think we're at 71 days operating expenditures, and our goal from the city council is 75 days. So we're nearing that goal steadily, and we feel very confident that this year we will not eat into that, and hopefully just steady the course, stay the course, and keep on moving toward a healthier fund balance.
So why is a 75-day goal important for a fund balance?
Well, that fund balance is what you would have to operate on if something catastrophic happened to the city, and we had expenditures that greatly exceeded revenues in a certain year, or something like that. It's kind of what you would fall back upon to continue to operate the city and provide services to the citizens in an event that we weren't receiving the revenue that we needed to in a certain year.
So it's what our mayor commonly refers to as a rainy day fund.
Sort of like that. I mean, there's that term is actually very specific in the accounting world, but yes, it's similar to a rainy day fund.
So now we're in the midst of preparing for the fiscal year 2017 budget process. And of course, the first question everyone wants to know is, how much is it going to cost me? Tell us what the proposed property tax rate is for the fiscal year that begins October 1.
It's important to staff and to the council that we maintain that property tax rate. It's not our intent to raise that, and so we're looking to maintain the 0.776 per $100 valuation, and we're maintaining services at that level. It's important to us to be able to do that.
And we've done that for a number of years now, maintain that rate of 77.6 cents, correct?
Correct. We're in a goal in the past that our rate had grown to 83 cents, and so we wanted to lower that, and we have little by little we chipped away at that. So we got down to 77 cents, and realized that we really needed to invest in some infrastructure and some capital expenses, and so we kind of halted the scales there. But it was important to not go any higher for sure.
And so if we were to lower the tax rate, I'm sure there are viewers who are watching and say, well, why don't you lower the rate even further? If we were to lower the rate, what would the result of that be?
One of the things we look at every year is what is the value of a penny? If we went down on that tax rate 1 cent, what would that cost the city? What would that cost the council in priorities? And this year, that cost would be about $460,000 that we would have to cut from the budget to do that. And that's difficult to do without canceling some services or sending home personnel. And so we are not getting the feedback that certain services are no longer needed. We're not getting feedback that certain services are no longer wanted. We certainly have lots of users of anything. It runs the gamut in the general fund, of course, from DREAM programs in the police department to senior center meals, just everything. And so we're getting feedback that those are well-used programs and important. And so as long as that's the case, we're going to do our best to hold steady.
So we have not yet received the certified tax roll from the Central Appraisal District. What's the likely impact to the average homeowner of maintaining the current property tax rate? That is, would they expect their levy to increase or decrease?
We actually did just get the certified taxes. And so we had seen some healthy growth in property tax valuation in the last couple of years, 8, 9, 10%. And that was a lot due to new property being added to the tax roll. But also, we've had a little market boom in our housing in San Angelo. Over the last 3 or 4 years, homes have been selling much higher than the previous market. And it's mandated by the state that the appraisal district has to keep those appraisals within market. And so as we've slowly made those appraisals more in line with the market, that's important that your most valuable asset, your home, is worth more than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago for sure. And so we've seen some growth in the appraisal, but the rate, of course, is staying the same so that we can kind of manage what that impact is to each citizen.
So Tina, I guess it's fair to say your personal impact will depend upon sort of what happens with your evaluation, how much it grows, and or whether it decreases.
Exactly, because as Maureen said earlier, the property tax rate stayed the same at 77.6 cents per $100 valuation. So depending on how the appraisal district values your home is where you will see an impact to your taxes that you are paying as a citizen. Of course, the appraisal district is a separate entity from the city, and we do not influence them in any way. And so, that keeps them objective. And so whatever they appraise your home at is what you will pay that tax rate upon the value of your home.
So, as I mentioned, we are in the midst of the budget process, and it's a very long and protracted process. So, Morgan, tell us how and when that budget process actually begins.
Sure. We kick off budget preparation in April, and that seems really early for a year that starts October 1st, but we have a lot to do. And so we begin with revenue estimates from directors and managers to kind of build what resources we have. We move into May, where we're proposing what expenses are available, and then we go into June, where we talk about any proposals for either expanded service or increases that are necessary just to maintain existing current service levels. And so that brings us to July and August, where we're before the council talking about those options and reporting back to them on the big issues.
And so, what a lot of people don't understand about the budget, Tina, is that it's actually a collection of a lot of different budgets. It's not just one budget. Sort of explain the differences between the different funds and the budgets.
Sure. Well, of course, the general fund is where the biggest portion of our budget. It's just under half of our total city budget. And that's where we account for things like we said earlier, public safety, operations, parks, things that are not necessarily supported by user fees or something along those lines. Of course, then we also have larger enterprise funds, which are meant to support themselves, such as the water fund, the sewer fund, the solid waste fund, those funds. So each fund operates on its own as far as budgeting revenues and expenditures. And of course, we always expect a balanced budget from each of the funds so that revenues are always exceeding or equal to expenditures. And so then each department submits that information to Morgan's office and to her staff, and they compile it into the larger budget document.
When you talk about those enterprise funds, I don't think a lot of people realize funds like the water fund or the airport fund or Fort Concho or civic events. Mm-hmm. They run a little bit like a business in that they are expected to support themselves with whatever revenue that they generate.
That's right. And so that's why, for example, the water rate study that we just completed was very important, because if the water utility fund can't sustain itself, then it can't continue to operate and it can't continue to provide water to our citizens. In the same regard, Fort Concho Fund is expected, it generates user fees. It's partly supported by the general fund, but is expected to support itself largely. And so it generates user fees, through museum entry and Christmas at Old Fort Concho, things like that. It is meant to sustain and to continue to be able to support itself in the long run.
So we're talking with our budget manager, Morgan Chegwidden, our finance director, Tina Carragher, and we'll be back right after this. Welcome back. We are continuing our conversation about city finances and the budget with our finance director, Tina Carragher, our budget manager, Morgan Chegwidden. Morgan, how are the expenses in the coming year, in fiscal year 17, which begins October 1, going to compare to this past year?
They're largely unchanged. We've talked a lot about the general fund today and that property tax is up a little bit, a healthy amount, a safe amount, and sales tax is down, a little bit as well. And so we anticipate that expenses in the general fund will be largely unchanged. And that's payroll, capital, everything. We're really, again, just holding the line on that. But I think you'll find something similar in all of the other budgets as well. So for example, in Fort Concho Fund, in State Office Building Fund. Each of our budgets, it's really largely unchanged. We usually try to keep up with the cost of living and try to give our employees pay raises. We try to keep up with the rising cost of health insurance, with rising cost of capital, things like that. But this year we're just trying to hold the line and probably won't see any increases in that way like you wouldn't expect normally in a year.
So Tina, I know one of the council priorities is increasing employee pay to ensure that they have a workforce that is qualified and that we're attracting new hires, and particularly among police officers and firefighters. Is the tightness of this year's budget going to impact city employee salaries?
That remains to be seen at this point. Of course, it largely has to do with council's directive. When we have our budget workshop coming up actually on August 11th at 8:30. And so we will get a feel for what they want to do, but because of the performance of sales tax revenue and our property tax revenue coming in at about 3.8% increase, we expect that most of that marginal revenue will be used for things like the rising cost of health care, retirement, things like that are things that we have to do as a city, as opposed to maybe council having more discretionary money to allocate or fund.
Now, Morgan, you've told me that the easiest budgets are those in which you have lots of money to spend or no money to spend. Now, explain what you mean by that.
And when I say easiest, I certainly don't mean it's less work, but I mean it's easier to make decisions. If we've got a budget, budgets are built around the margins. It's not unusual. So any new revenue coming in, we immediately try to match with any new expenses we know that are coming up. And so in a year that we have a lot of money, we certainly can fund things that meet the council priorities, debate back and forth what has the most merit, but ultimately come up with a budget that a lot of people can be proud of. But then in years like this one, where we have very little money, it's easy just because there's not a lot to talk about. We certainly have a lot of really valid proposals out there from directors and managers saying these things have got to happen in my department to be able to continue. And this year we've just had very frank conversations with people saying, I just don't have it this year. I just don't have it. We need to be cognizant of what that means for the long term, but mostly there's not a lot to talk about because we just don't have that marginal revenue.
And how do the city directors normally react to that news? As, hey, we'd like to help you, but there's no money.
They're actually pretty receptive for the most part. They understand the fact that this is what we have and this is what we can do, and they're usually really willing to work with finance and city management to find where they can maybe cut expenditures or to find where maybe they need to review fees or things like that might either bring in more money or use less money to try to balance their budget in a way that they can still provide services, because for the most part, all of our directors are very dedicated to serving the citizens of San Angelo. So.
I think it's surprising to some people how much of that general fund supported by sales and property taxes is dedicated to police and fire protection. How much of the general fund goes to those two departments, police and fire?
49.8% of our general fund budget is for public safety, and so that's certainly where our commitment is. That's certainly where we see growth in expenditures, perhaps in years that there are none anywhere else. But that's our commitment, is that we are sure to provide core services.
And so if you were going to reduce property taxes, for instance, then that would have an impact on police and fire protection.
Almost certainly.
Yeah.
I don't know how you could without it, and it's certainly not something that we think anybody has the appetite for.
In fact, our property tax revenue in itself would not be enough to cover the cost of public safety. So I think that people would be surprised to hear that as well. We don't even bring enough revenue from property tax just to cover public safety, much less all the other services that the city provides for them.
which was the intent when we levied the property tax. Please, citizens, let us levy a property tax so we can provide public safety. We've moved well beyond that.
Right.
So that was the original intent in the charter of the property tax?
Correct. And it's for San Angelo, yes.
Wow, interesting. So speaking of core services, the first phase of a water rate increase in order to provide water took effect in January. How has that helped the financial sustainability of our water utility?
I think that remains to be seen at this point. The rate increase just went into effect January 1st, so we haven't even had a full year to really assess how it's affected their fund balance. Of course, we're coming into the last couple of months of this fiscal year are where we really see some seasonal revenues coming in. And so, once we get a full year of the water rate increase, I think we'll have a much better handle on how that's going to help. The first 2 years of the water rate increase for the plan that was given to us were meant to help increase the fund balance in the water fund because it has been failing, basically. And so that we've made sure in this next budget process, Morgan has worked with the water utility director and assistant director to make sure that we've budgeted revenue over expenditure for next fiscal year to help with that goal for their fund balance. I think the term they've been using is righting the ship. So to get that fund balance where it needs to be so that the water fund can continue to operate in future years and provide service to water customers. And then, beyond that is when we try to build up for needs like infrastructure or water sources or things like that. And so that's where we kind of are right now with that. We do have an amount budgeted in both the water and sewer funds for capital expenditures. So we do plan to try to meet some infrastructure needs this next fiscal year. We've talked a little bit internally about possibly leveraging that capital expenditure budget and perhaps look at issuing debt so that we could do much larger scale projects. For example, we have streets being done right now, reconstruction for streets being done. And of course, the water fund wants to keep up with the infrastructure underneath those streets. And so if we could leverage that capital expenditure money into a bigger debt issue so that they could do those larger scale projects and keep up with what we're doing with streets, that would be optimal. And so, that's kind of where we are right now.
So just to sum up, the water rate increase was not just to increase our water supply, but to make sure that the water utility was financially sustainable and to allow a more aggressive approach towards improving the water infrastructure and coupling it with something like street improvements.
That's right.
And I think it's important to note that we asked San Angeloans to conserve water, and we did. I mean, we came out in force. There was a groundswell of support for xeriscaping and rain capturing and things like that. And so we're going into a new normal where we just don't use as much water as we did in the 90s and the 2000s, and that's terrific. It's important as a West Texas city to have that resources for our children and our grandchildren. But what happens is that there's a financial impact to that. And so we had built our rates around an old usage model. And for fiscal year 15, water fund ended the year with revenue under expenditures or a loss of about $1.6 million, and for the first time dipping their fund balance into a negative. So we'd really exhausted all reserves before we took action, and that was important because we're very sensitive to water customers that this was something that they had to build into their budget. And so we certainly didn't take action until we knew that it was the only option.
So Tina, you mentioned about street improvements, and of course that's a core service and it's a city council priority. So much so that the city council not too long ago approved $80 million to rebuild San Angelo's most compromised streets, beginning with MLK and with Bell Street. How are we able to afford that $80 million package to rebuild streets?
Sure. Well, first of all, the $80 million package is really a plan at this point. So the plan is to issue debt every other year for 10 years in the amount of $16 million. And really, from our operations guys, they've told us that that's really about all that you could do as far as work is concerned anyway in that 2-year period. And so that we kind of worked with them to see what amount would work, as far as projecting that. So a couple of things allowed us to do that. First of all, I think it was in the fiscal year 16 budget process, council voted to allocate 9.86 cents of the property tax rate to debt service rather than the 8 cents that it was before. So that increased our capacity to issue debt. And it did not increase the tax rate. It just lowered what we spend on maintenance and operations a little bit. In addition, as we have debt come off of our, we pay down debt. Of course, that also increases our capacity. And so just things like that working together We just had enough capacity that we could do that over, and our debt guys just kind of structure it out in a way that we're able to issue that debt and pay it off.
Now, you guys are not prone to bragging. It's one of the things I love about you. But you do win award after award after award. So I do want you to brag on yourself just for a moment, some of the hardware that you've collected over the past year, Tina.
Sure. Well, for our fiscal year 14 budget, we're waiting on results for our fiscal year 15, sorry, not budget, but our financial statements, our comprehensive annual financial report, or we call it the CAFR.
Which a layperson like me would just call it an audit.
Yes.
Okay.
It's the result of the annual audit, our financial statements. But we did receive an award for that. It just means that we're being very transparent with our financial statements. We're presenting them in such a way that the users are able to understand it and access it and know how to use it. And let's see, we received the budget award, of course, for the budget book that Morgan and her staff produce. Transparency Award from the Texas Comptroller. We received the Platinum Award for that, which is the highest honor a city can receive.
And it was the first time that we'd received that.
It sure was. And that just means that we're putting everything that we possibly can on our website. People have access to anything they want to know about our city's finances. We're happy to tell you anything, show you anything. And let's see, finally, the Investment Certificate Award, which just means that we're adhering to the Public Funds Investment Act and being very conscientious in how we invest the city's funds for our taxpayers. It's not an award, but I also always like to brag on our debt rating. You know, the city has the highest debt rating that it can for a city of our size at AA, and so.
And explain why that's important.
That's important because we can't issue debt unless, well, our interest rate, of course.
Right.
When we go to issue debt, we get a much lower interest rate. The higher the rating, the lower the interest rate, and so the less
Which
we pay.
saves taxpayers dollars.
Yes, exactly.
So you mentioned about the transparency, and I know that's been important to you, and since you've been the director, it's gone from silver to gold now to platinum. Why, for you personally, has it been important to be more transparent with all of the city's financial records?
Well, just personally, I'm open and honest, and I have a code of ethics as a CPA, and so I want there to never be any question as to how we conduct the city's finances, and I want our citizens to know that they can trust the finance department to be good stewards of their money.
So, and Morgan, if people want to access any of those records, where can they do so?
They're always available at costatx.us/budget or in our office at City Hall. We also have a copy of the draft budget available with the city clerk, and so we want to get that information out to folks because it's intended that local government is your most accessible form of government. And so that's why the transparency is important to us as well, because my neighbors, my church members, they come up to me and they say, what is going on with this? And I say, let me send you some information. It's on our website. And so that's super important to us because we're your neighbors and we pay taxes too, and it's important to maintain that trust.
We've been talking with Morgan Chegwin. She is our budget manager. Tina Carriger, she is our finance director. And we hope you'll join us for the next episode of The City.